Hey guys, I'm back with another coding video. I know it's been too long. We're back. We're back to coding finally. Today we're going to be making an iExternal application, which is basically one of these cool customized ribbon panels that you have in Revit. Today you're going to be making your own, which means if you work in an organization and you have a cool stack of scripts you've developed and you want it to be in its own fancy ribbon that you can just see when you launch Revit, you can be able to create something like that after this video. So there are two methods we care about for the iExternal application. This is the onStartup and the onShutdown method. The onStartup method controls what happens to your ribbon when you launch Revit, and the onShutdown method controls what happens when you shut down Revit. Very simple, right? We also do care about the object that goes into those two methods. And this object is called the UI controlled application. This object is what controls all of the stuff we want to do today. It's able to add external commands to the Revit ribbon. So for today, we're going to be including our hello world command in the ribbon. It's able to create things that control when a view is activating or idling away. So like when your Revit is kind of just loading, that's the UI controlled application at work there. And it also controls a dialog box popping up when you click on something. So it's going to be a very interesting object to explore. It is also passed into the onStartup or onShutdown method. So this is exactly how it's going to look when we implement it in Visual Studio. One last thing is, how is the ribbon structured? Because we're going to be creating a lot of things in C Sharp, but it's good to understand how exactly your Revit panel is structured. So you have the Revit tab, which is the one that shows up at the top here, like create, insert, annotate, view. That's the tab. You have the panel, which is what houses the different respective tools. So you have like a geometry panel that has a cut and join, you have modify panel that has move and all these other buttons. So in terms of hierarchy, we want to first create a tab and then a panel and then the buttons inside the panel. Keeping this in mind is going to make it a lot easier to understand the code when we dive into Visual Studio, because we're going to be creating these three different elements and they're going to be deriving information from each other. Okay, guys, so this is where we left off the last time with our hello world Revit iExternal command. If you missed the video where we made this, I'm going to put a link above. We created this from scratch. It's really just an implementation of the iExternal command interface and a task dialog that shows hello world. I'm going to put a link so you can see how to create this, or you can literally just copy and paste everything you see on the screen to create your hello world command. And we're going to be building a application that will launch this command. Two resources we're going to be exploring today is the Revit API docs, which you can see docs for the different versions of Revit, and also the Revit Help Center. So firstly, let's look at the Revit Help Center and see what they have to say about ribbon classes. One of the reasons I'm showing this is because as a programmer, one of your strongest skill sets is actually searching for information. There's only so much you can know and memorize on your own. It's really helpful to be able to go online and look for solutions that you need. So just by searching, how do I create an iExternal application, you will come to this Revit help page. This is for Revit 22, but it still applies to what we're trying to do. So one thing we should look at is, how is the code structured versus how is it showing up on Revit? And this will help us understand exactly what we're trying to do. So firstly, the first thing you want to do is to create a tab. So you know the tabs we're used to seeing: home, insert, annotate, and so on. Firstly, we want to create our own tab and give it a name. So you create a string, initiate it with the name of the variable and give it a value. And then we reference the application, which is from the UI controlled application. The UI controlled application object is also something that needs to be instantiated as a variable. So we call it application. And then we access its create ribbon tab property to create this tab name. Next thing we want to do is to create the panel itself. And the panel is ribbon panel, and it's called this panel name. So this is the name. When you see it, it's referencing the tab name, which is this tab name, and the panel name, which is this panel name. And then we want to create the actual button inside the panel. So a panel can have more than one button. Like if you look into your modified tab, for example, you see panels that have several buttons in them. This is the same with what we are trying to create. So first create the tab, then the panel, and then to create the button, we're going to be accessing the push button data variable, which derives from the push button class. We're going to be looking at the classes and objects in Revit API in the API docs. So let's look at the UI controlled application class and see what we can access from there as a start. Let's take a look at some of the methods. So you can easily see that what we're trying to do is already included as the methods for the UI controlled application. So here's our create ribbon tab and our create ribbon panel. These are the different ways to create a ribbon panel. So you can choose just the name of the panel, or you can put two strings, one of them being the name of the tab, or you can put the name of the tab and the string. This is what is referred to in C# as overloading. So there is more than one way to access a method for any given object, and it will still give you a result. So let's click on Create Ribbon tab just as an example. And here you see more information as to how you can actually create a ribbon tab. So these are the ways you can start to use the Revit API docs to guide you. Look at this. It's a full guide, same as what we had in the Autodesk Help website, exactly the same thing. And here it's also showing you first you create the tab, then you create the buttons, and then you create the panel. I prefer to create the panel right after the tab just because that's how my brain works logically, but I'm guessing this is the best practice, so I would recommend following this if you can. Going back to the visual aid, you can see that my button 1 is the name of the button. So you have 4 fields when you're creating a push data variable. There's the actual name of the button, which is just the name we're giving it in our code. Then there's the name that shows up in Revit, which in this case is my button 1, my button 2. That's the second string. There is the link to the DLL file. So this is the link to, for us, our hello world command, because that's where we've compiled it. So it needs a link to a DLL file that it can run. There's many ways to achieve this. You can create a code that gets the executing assembly, which means you can create a code that will reference your DLL file that you're compiling within your code. But I feel like that's a bit more advanced for where we are right now. So we're just going to find a way to copy the path of our button. And there's finally a link to the class of the button we're trying to create, which is inside our code. So let's start coding so it's a lot clearer than just talking about it, right? Back into Visual Studio. It's been a while. So the first thing we want to do is to create a new class. So to do that, we would go to our first Revit plugin, which is the entire namespace for all our classes. Right click and say add and say new item. Whenever you're adding something to a namespace, this is the way to do it. We want a class for now, so we're going to say class, and we're just going to rename it now so that our panel application comes in the right name for the class. So I already have a test here because I was trying to test out this workflow. So we're going to give it a cool name like new app and add it. Now we have our new class. We can see it inherited here under our namespace, our first Revit plugin. Next thing we want to do is to change this from internal to public because we want a public class that can be referenced everywhere. And then we want to inherit the external application interface. If you are wondering what an interface is, please watch my video on what our interface is on the beginner series. It's showing red, which means that we haven't implemented it explicitly. So to see our options for implementing, I will use Alt Enter or Control Plus as shown on the screen. And it's giving me the options. Like I said in the presentation, we need to implement the onShutdown and onStartup methods. So that's what exactly we need to do for it to run. There we have it. It's no longer giving us an error, and it's now calling on the using Autodesk Revit.ui because that is what the UI controlled application is accessing. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is to return a result because, like I said, the result needs to tell us that the code is done running and it can just stop. It doesn't need to keep going. It doesn't need to keep loading. And in this case, we want to say the result succeeded, right? So return result succeeded. And that's for both of them, both on startup and on shutdown. This throw new not implemented exception is an exception, which means if it doesn't work, throw an exception. But that's not what we're trying to do here. We're trying to create an instance where it actually does work, and then it returns a result that it worked successfully. So I'm going to add return result dot succeeded to both of them. Good. So that's the first boilerplate that we need. Now we need to start adding things to the on startup part of our code, because on shutdown is what happens when you close Revit. So we need to implement our code in the on startup part. Now, this is a good time to refer to Revit API docs or the Revit help sheet if you don't know what to put in here. So the first thing we want to do is create the string that will contain the tab name. So string new tab variable equals to, and I want to call our tab BIM coders. You can call it whatever you want. Always end with a semicolon. And that's how you know that your code is working. It's green right now because we're not calling it anywhere. So whenever you make a new variable but you haven't used it elsewhere, it will underline it in green to tell you that you have not used your variable anywhere. So let's use it now. We're going to say application dot create ribbon tab. And new tab is the tab we want to create. Awesome. So according to this, the ribbon tab does not need to be called on as a variable to work, but because we're going to be leveraging the ribbon panel for creating the push button data, we need to actually create a variable for it that will host the ribbon panel. So to do this, we'll go back and say ribbon panel and then give it the name of the variable. Let's just call it new panel in this case. And then access the create ribbon panel method from application. So application dot create ribbon panel. And if you just highlight this, you'll see the different ways you can make a ribbon panel. So it's asking for the tab name and the panel name plus 2 overloads, which means there are 2 other ways to do this. So in this case, we're going to go with our tab name, which is new tab, and then our panel name, which will be called our first panel in string form. Awesome. So now we have our tab, we have our panel. Let's create our buttons. So first thing we want to do is create the push button data. Again, referencing this, what we have to do is create push button data, give it a variable name, instantiate it for the first time because it's a new one, and then give it our name for it in the code, the name we want to appear, the path to the command, and the name of the class in our code that we are referencing for the button. So you could copy and paste this, but let's just type it from scratch. So push button data. Let's give it a variable name button, instantiated for the first time as new push button data. And immediately we'll see the options for creating a new push button data. So there's the 4 strings, one of them being the name of the button, the text we wanted to show in Revit, the assembly name, and the class name. So let's do that. Let's give it the first name as button 1 because this doesn't show up anywhere except maybe within our code or in Revit events. Next, let's give a name for the actual button. This is the one that shows up on Revit as the name of the button. So let's call it our first button. Then we need a link to where the DLL assembly is being compiled. The syntax for this would be at, and then the link to our DLL in quotation marks as a string. To find this link, if you would remember when we were creating the hello world command under properties, we actually had a link created to the add-ins folder where we wanted our DLL file to be compiled to. So this is where you should go and find your DLL file. And I already have mine here, our first Revit plugin.dll. So I'm going to click on it, right click. And because I'm on Windows 10, I'm going to say copy as path. So I'm going to get the full path to this file. So I could easily just paste the path in here, but I want it to be a little cleaner. So I'm actually going to get rid of this and create a new string with the path. So let's call it string. And this string will be our assembly. And equals to at, because it's a URL, and string. And then we will paste that path. So this is my own path. Yours should look slightly different. There are other ways to get this, but this is the simplest way. So let's stick with this for now. For a string, we only need 2 quotation marks. So let's get rid of that. And now we can just put our string assembly in here. It's green again because we haven't called it anywhere. So assembly. And now that green should be gone. Awesome. So the last thing we need is the class name. This is the actual name of the class inside our code. So it would be our first Revit plugin dot hello world, because that's where we have our hello world command. So put that in strings. Our first Revit plugin dot hello world. All we need now is our semicolons, because that's the syntax that we need to have for our code to be clean. Awesome. So now we've created the push button data to reference everything we need. Now we add this to the actual button. This is the push button data, but we actually need to create the button that will be hosted inside the panel. So to do that, we'll call on the push button variable and give it name push button. And say new panel dot add item, because now we want to add the button. And we need to add this button, but because right now it's a push button data type, we need to cast it as push button for it to work. So we are instantiating a new push button, but we're referencing a push button data type. So we would get an error if we're not able to cast it as a push button. And this is how the code needs to be written so that it works. Awesome. So if you've made it this far, you've created your new tab, you've created your new panel, you've created your push button data, which is what we will feed into the actual button. We are now ready to write our manifest file. So how we would normally write the manifest file is this for the external command. The good thing about a manifest file is that you can have several things in the same file. You don't need to create a new one each time. So we're just going to copy this. Ideally, we only want to copy the data that's in between the add-in syntax. So this is actually XML. It's a markup language. And how it works is you have 2 of these greater than less than symbols to open and the one with the / to close. So that's how you know the start and end. If we were to copy the entire thing, it would look like we're creating a brand new thing. So what we actually need is just the add-in section, and we'll copy this and paste it just before the Revit addings closing tag, because that's where it starts here as well. Now, one thing is our command type doesn't have the name as part of its properties for the add-in, but the application will need one. So we'll start by changing this from command to application. And then we will add the name tag. So like I said, it's open, name, and close. And here it's already helped me out by filling out the closing tag. So this is the actual name of our application. This is what will show up when you launch Revit, and it's asking you, do you want to allow this to run? So we're going to call it new app because that's the name of our application. This is the same assembly because they're all in the same assembly. It does not need to change. This is the unique ID, which we will create by going to Tools, create GUID, and then copy the GUID. Get rid of all the extra stuff because we only need the characters in between. And then let's go into the full class name. This will be the name of our application now and not the command. So it will be our first Revit plugin dot new app. Awesome. This is the text that shows up when there is an event like an undo and you want to see what did you undo. So we can make this new app, or we can leave it as hello world because that's the actual function we want it to host. And we have the vendor ID and description that doesn't change depending on what you did last time. So for today, we're only making our application to show up in Revit. We will not be adding one of those wonderful graphic icons that you see when you create a panel. So it's just going to be mostly text. But I would like this to be a fun challenge for you. If you've been following this far, I've already shown you how to search for information. So I want to give you this challenge. Why don't you search for how to add an image to your panel? You can use either the Revit Help tool or the Revit API docs. And when you're succeeded, I want you to leave a comment that says, I did it. This should be very interesting as it builds your confidence as a programmer that you don't need to always rely on some external help, but you can actually search for information yourself. So find out how to add an icon. It's actually very, very easy. And I want you to try it yourself just as a fun challenge. If you succeed, just leave me a comment and I'll respond. Awesome. So it's time for us to debug our code. Since we already set up our properties before to debug to this folder and we already set it to launch Revit, we don't need to do anything extra. It's going to apply these rules to our new app as well. So we'll go into new app, we can save all and start debugging. Once Revit is loaded, you should see your new app showing up. It's asking you, do you want to launch it? This is because it's not registered with Autodesk. And so it will always bring this pop up when it's not yet registered with Autodesk. That's fine. You created it, so it is a trusted source. You will not corrupt your own software with viruses. So just say always load or load once, depending on if you want it to always show up or if you want it to just show up this time. I'm going to say load once. And once Revit is done loading, I'm going to open my sample project, not the Autodesk sample project, because that has things created in it that we do not know the origin, but our own sample project that we created for the last video. And you can already see our BIM coders tab right there. When you click on it, you should see our first button, our first panel. And when you click on our first button, it runs the hello world command. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. I'm looking forward to see you adding an image to this. Just leave me a comment when you've done it and subscribe so that I'm able to keep doing this, and I'm encouraged that you're actually finding this useful. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next one.